Welcome, searchers and seekers. We are still in the book of Isaiah. We're in 2nd Isaiah, and we are in chapter 49. Listen to me, O coastlands. Pay attention, you peoples from far away. Yahweh called me before I was born. He's talking about Israel. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like sharp sword, and in the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow, and his quiver he hid me away. So Israel is like an instrument or weapon of Yahweh, but in the sense of being an instrument or tool, as we'll see later. And he said to me, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." So here we have this very clear statement that the suffering servant is Israel. And in verse 5, and now Yahweh says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, etc. So, and yet another clear indication that the servant is not an individual, but Israel itself. Now, Christians took this idea as explaining the purpose and nature of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was seen as fulfilling this typology, this type of person, this type of passage. The idea being that what lies covered or latent in the Old Testament becomes patently obvious in the New Testament. And it makes sense. This is a way of looking at Jesus because this is a time where Israel is downtrodden, is suffering, and Jesus certainly suffered and died. And so he was more like a suffering servant than a Davidic military king. So it would be appropriate for Christians to look at this to explain who Jesus was for them, but this is not a prophecy of an individual who's coming in the future. This is a statement about why Israel has been suffering in the past and present. And the results of this servant Israel are not just for Israel's benefit, as it says in verse 6. Is it too light a thing, you being my servant, that I should only restore Israel? I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And they translated end of the earth here. So this idea that Israel will be a light to the nations is a new idea. And it's sort of amazing when you think about it. Again, we have to look at it at the time. Israel was a micronation and very small, not very powerful, and there were much larger empires with great art, architecture, science, and literatures and religions, and much more important for history, there was one professor I heard of who did a whole history of the ancient Middle East. And he devoted one whole lecture to Israel. And he said, this is way too much, but I do it because of the influence of the religions that came out of Israel. So Israel was really this micronation, and this idea that 2nd Isaiah is saying that you will be a light to the nations is a very large dream. Is it grandiosity? Is it hubris? Is it thinking too much of themselves? Or what is it and why is it? And yet, ironically, if you look at it, two great religions, Christianity and Islam, came forth from Judaism, and currently 2 billion people are adherents to those religions, if not more. So in a sense, and everyone in the world knows about Judaism and Christianity. So in a sense, many of these other larger nations have disappeared from the face of the earth, but the Hebrew tradition has remained. So, but as I say now, it seems inconceivable that Isaiah would say that. Israel is a nation that has been in exile in another superpower, and it is just returning, hasn't even really started rebuilding its nation. And Isaiah's claiming that Israel will be a light to the nations. It's just amazing. I'd like to point out 49:15. Can a woman forget her nursing child, or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even those may forget, yet I will not forget you. The Lord talking about Israel and Zion. So this is one of the few feminine images for the divine in the Hebrew Scriptures. There are some, and I like to point them out. In chapter 50, verses 4 and following, we have the third of the servant songs. And the phrase servant songs is a modern way of addressing and describing these. The Lord God has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious, I did not turn back. I give my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. So yes, Christians can take this as a very specific reference or metaphor or theme in their minds, foretelling what the sufferings of Christ were like. So yes, this applies. You could make this an application. What is latent in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, becomes patently obvious in the New Testament, according to that Christian way of interpreting. But here again, we see that this servant is Israel, and it is very clear from the context why that is the case. It's because Israel has been in exile and has been weakened, and many of its people have been killed. And I mean, we can look at it this way, that they exiled anyone with skills, anyone with money, and a lot of people probably did not survive that 200, 300, 400-mile journey. And so it was gruesome, and you couldn't take much with you, and you had to eke out a living in your new country. So it was really suffering. As I've said many times, the book of Isaiah is very poetic, and it's probably a tradition of many, many men and or women writing over hundreds of years. Here's an example from chapter 51 at the beginning. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abram your father, and to Sarah who bore you. Listen to me, you that pursue righteousness, that seek Yahweh. So look to the rock that you were taken from. Look back. And I like that metaphor, and we see the doublet again, rock and quarry. In chapter 52, we have a lot of sayings celebrating Jerusalem and the return to Jerusalem. God has redeemed Jerusalem, and now we know why. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Zion being another name for Jerusalem. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, Israel, Jerusalem, your God reigns. So yes, Zion is part of Jerusalem, and so Jerusalem is referred to by that part. And Jerusalem itself stands for the capital, the cultic center of Israel. So in a sense, all of Israel. In 52:13, we have what some people say is the most interesting of the servant songs. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. So again, this suffering servant, no one expects much out of Israel because of the terrible condition it's in, yet the many nations and kings shall appreciate what they had not contemplated. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom the arm of the Lord revealed, the arm of the Lord, the power of the Lord. For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty. We should look at him. So Israel has no special form. It's downtrodden. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with infirmity, as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. So there's a metaphor there of a man, of an individual, a suffering servant, but that is also the nation of Israel who is coming out of exile. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have all turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So that sounds very much like Christianity and something that Paul himself would have written. And this is part of the book of Isaiah. And so, yeah, naturally, the Christianity would take this and would look at Jesus as something like that, as a sacrificial offering. And it's not that surprising because sacrifices were made at the temple for hundreds of years. So there is this idea of a sacrifice being made. Verse 7 reads, He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And 12, Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So this fourth and last servant song is something that you can understand why Christians applied to what happened to Jesus. But in its original context, this is about the nation of Israel. Israel was downtrodden and suffering, and there were at the time sin offerings. So this idea of going to the temple, bringing an offering for your sin is a very central and well-known part of Hebrew religion at the time. And that's a large part of the reason for the sacrifices at the temple. It's a way of seeking forgiveness between neighbors and between an individual and God. So this idea of sacrificial recompense or forgiveness granted through sacrifice is something well known. And this, again, is how we've seen that Israel will not only survive and be brought back to Jerusalem, but will be a light to the nations. And that is what we are seeing here. The nations look at Israel and don't see much and don't expect anything great, and then they have to reevaluate Israel. And Israel, again, serves as a source of forgiveness and as a source of light to all the nations. In 54:5, for your maker is your husband. So God is the maker. The Yahweh of hosts is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called. So again, this looking at the tribal national God, Yahweh, more as the one God of all the earth. So there is this growing sense of monotheism. In 54:11 and 12, Jerusalem is described in this beautiful way, and we will see this in the later tradition and in the New Testament. O afflicted one, storm-tossed and not comforted, I am about to set your stones in antimony, and lay your foundations with sapphires. I will make your pinnacles of rubies, your gates of jewels, and all your walls of precious stones. So this image of Jerusalem, the holy city, as just made out of beautiful sparkling gems. And so that would be like in a positive way of looking at some of the aspects in apocalyptic literature, that yes, there's destruction, but afterwards there could be this redemption. In chapter 55, we have this: seek the Lord, seek Yahweh. Whenever we have the capitalized four letters, Lord, that means Yahweh. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says Yahweh. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So this idea that God's ways are inscrutable, that we human beings cannot know them, that God is high in heaven and his way of thinking is different than our way of thinking here on earth. And this idea has not fully been expressed that much in the Old Testament. We don't actually. One thing I've learned rereading and going through the Bible again, the Bible sort of a Rorschach test for you, the reader, and for me it's just like there's not much theology per se. There's not much actual discussion about the nature of God. It's more how God affects Israel and Israel's history. So it's really more political theology, if theology at all. But here's some theology, and this is, I think, a very profound statement that God's ways, God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and that the way God thinks is not something that we should really expect to fully understand. You may or may not like that or agree with that theology, but I point it out because I think it is an important part of the understanding here in Isaiah of God's nature. Chapter 61 of Isaiah is one of the more famous chapters. The Spirit of Yahweh, the Spirit of Lord God, is upon me, because Yahweh has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives. And Israel itself was captive, held in exile. To proclaim a year of the Lord's favor. So again, this is the deliverance, the return from exile. And this is the good news. And not only that, but in verses 5 and following, we'll see this idea that Israel will not only prosper, but become greater than many of the other nations. Strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners shall till your land. But you will be called priests of the Lord, and you shall be named ministers of our God. You shall enjoy the wealth of the nations, and in their riches you shall glory, because your shame was double, because you pay the price for exile double.